Hello, I'm Tom, co-host of the Geeks&Gaijin podcast. If you're listening to this, you are either my friend and co-host John, or you are a random internet stranger who stumbled across our YouTube channel by accident. If you fall into the latter category, do not panic. You are under no obligation to stay. Feel free to leave whenever you feel like it. In fact, it is highly recommended that you do. Today I'll be talking about one of my favourite genres of anime, Shounen Battle. And I'll be talking about one of my least favourite parts of Shounen Battle, how they write female characters. The majority of this video will be discussing Fire Force Season 1, Demon Slayer Season 1, and My Hero Academia Seasons 1 through 4. So if you haven't seen any of those shows yet, feel free to pause this video and go watch them without any preconceptions. This video will still be here when you're finished with them. We'll start this video with discussing the catalyst for its creation, Fire Force. I've already reviewed Fire Force twice on the podcast itself, once at the 12th episode mark and once at the 24 episode mark, so I won't be going through my opinions on it again, other than to reiterate I did enjoy the show overall. And that Mayday's metal as hell and I love it! Fire Force is good in that it has an assortment of female characters, rather than just one or two tokens, but the character writing on each of those characters as individuals is so poor that commendation doesn't really mean anything. Now obviously my perspective on what makes a well-written female character is a little skewed, and it might not align exactly with what female anime fans actually would like in their representation, but hear me out. The most obvious candidate for best female representative in Fire Force would be Maki, who has incredible combat skills, a high amount of pyromantic power, and exceptional physical strength. However, outside of her combat ability, Maki's character writing doesn't really exceed the usual tropes of stereotypical female characters, given that her two main characteristics are that she's a hopeless romantic and that she's incredibly insecure about her physical appearance despite having the body of an Amazon goddess. Essentially, she could kick your ass, but she'd rather stand around looking cute instead. You'll want to remember that becomes a recurring theme later on. The other major female character that Fire Force introduces early is Iris. Iris is distinct from Maki in that she does not assume the role of a fighter. Instead, she is a nun, whose function in the Fire Force is to provide spiritual guidance. Sometimes this can be to the members of the Fire Force themselves, but more often than not it is both to the enemies that the Fire Force are extinguishing and the relatives of said infernals once all the violence is finished. Whilst not so dumbstruck by romance as Maki is, the show rarely neglects an opportunity to demean Iris' character either. Outside of her narrative function, the main purpose of Iris in Fire Force appears to be to provide the audience with both moments of moe cuteness and with sexual objectification. The scales are tipped even further by the fact that Iris, unlike Maki, is a non-combatant and therefore has even less opportunity to influence the plot of Fire Force. More on that later. One of the later additions to Fire Force's female cast that I had high hopes for initially was Lisa. Similar to Maki, Lisa is a powerful pyromancer, which makes her pretty useful in a fight. The writer also took the time to make her part of the general plot, connecting her to multiple characters in the core conflict. The exact form in which these connections manifest, however, are a cause for concern. As a brainwashed child turned spy turned traitor, the core of Lisa's character lies in her decision to either follow the orders of her abusers or follow her romantic relationship with Vulcan and leave the White Clad behind. The full extent of Lisa's story hasn't been finished by the end of Season 1 of Fire Force, or at least as far as I can tell. I haven't read the manga. But what elements are present in Season 1 do raise some issues that I hope aren't continued into Season 2. By the end of Season 1 of Fire Force, Lisa has been taken away from the White Clad and is in the quote-unquote safe hands of the Fire Force. However, this hasn't come about by any decision on Lisa's part herself. Instead, Captain Obi and Vulcan defeated her in combat and stripped her of any physical agency that would grant her the ability to actually make a choice between the two sides. As such, her loyalty has yet to actually be expressed. I hope this is a recurring theme in Season 2, but the way that Fire Force has approached Lisa's character so far leaves me sceptical. The fact that the brainwashing has robbed Lisa of most of her mental agency, combined with the fact that she's often designed to be wearing quite skimpy outfits, especially that white-clad one, leads me to believe she's been positioned more as a trophy for the men of Fire Force to compete over, rather than her own actual character. Whilst on the topic of female characters with questionably villainous intent, I would never describe Princess Hibana as a truly positive depiction of women in anime, but she still possesses an impressive amount of power for someone of her gender in this genre. Fire Force in fact has 2 female characters leading its fire divisions, which, while still objectively imbalanced, is sadly refreshing for a show of this kind. The issues I have with Hibana loop back round to the problems I raised with Iris, which is appropriate considering how closely connected the 2 characters are. When Hibana is first introduced, she and Iris have an exchange which highlights the different perspectives the 2 characters have. This, combined with their joint backstory, seems to position the 2 characters as ideological rivals, even if Iris couldn't possibly physically compete with Hibana. No, not like that. Pervs. After this debate, the plot rapidly builds to a confrontation between our protagonists in the 8th and Hibana's 5th. Now, by all narrative sense, this would mean that the divide between Iris and Hibana is brought to the forefront of the plot. And this does happen in theory. Seeing her old friend as her responsibility, Iris decides to go to the 5th alone to try and talk down Hibana. Sadly, rather than move the plot forward in any meaningful way or expand upon its characters and philosophies, Fire Force instead just forces Hibana to strip Iris naked with fire, for reasons that I can only assume were tasteless fanservice, and effectively make her a damsel in distress. As such, Iris accomplishes nothing more than forcing her friends to come and raid the 5th, which, I remind you, they were planning on doing anyway. After the raid is over and Shinra has won his rematch against Hibana, the show continues to waste both her and Iris' potential. Now, you'd think that after Shinra had eliminated the physical threat that Hibana had posed, she and Iris would be able to continue their intellectual debate, but on a level playing field this time. However, Hibana has apparently found Jesus since being punched a single time, and therefore has decided that all her behaviour up until this point, which he was fully on board with moments ago, was actually kinda bad. She blames this on having no one to turn to. Now, all the evidence the show has shown us so far tells us that Hibana is the one that abandoned Iris, and knowing how much of a lovely person Iris is, Hibana could probably have gone and seen Iris anytime she felt she had no one to turn to, but that's not really what I'm getting at right now. What I am getting at is that you'd think that Iris would be the best person to resolve this issue for Hibana, considering she's the person she has known the longest and has the deepest personal connection to, despite her recently hostile actions towards her. However, the show thinks that instead this is Shinra's perfect time to shine. The guy who just punched her in the face. Shinra claims that he can be someone that Hibana can rely on, as he is going to be a hero that everyone can rely on. Now, I do not understand why Hibana would believe him in this situation. These two have only met twice, and both times Shinra has been actively trying to undermine Hibana's interests, and he had just punched her in the face. I don't know about you guys, but if someone were to punch me in the face and then call himself a hero for doing it, I probably wouldn't be on board. Now, not only is Hibana on board, but apparently she falls in love with Shinra because of this. What? Call me a cynic, but I think there's a fairly obvious reason for all these leaps in narrative logic, which is that the writer wanted Shinra to be popular regardless of whether he'd earned it or not. Now, this scene does tie in to the defeat means friendship trope, which is fairly common in shonen anime. It's where a foe or rival or villain joins forces with the hero after being defeated, either because they respect the hero's power, or they feel honour bound to serve him, or that they just weren't all that evil in the first place, really. Even with it being a mainstay of the genre, however, this scene still feels like it's taking it a little far. The fact that Hibana worries about having no one to rely on sort of comes out of the blue, but it's not a completely unrealistic underlying insecurity of the character. What's weird is that it's Shinra who is responding to that fear. It doesn't feel like a natural progression of the story beats so far. Instead, it feels like it's been forced in to give Shinra another big, romantic, heroic moment that he doesn't really need. So at the end of the arc, Shinra seems to be the only character who's really gained anything from it. Hibana joins the good guys, which is nice, but she also seems to lose some of her strength and impact in the process. Falling in love with Shinra seems to have cooled her temperament a bit, but she also acts sort of submissive to him with how much she praises him, which is weird for a guy who physically assaulted her. No, I'm not dropping this, it's still really weird and uncomfortable. She still maintains her sort of dominatrix tone with the rest of the cast apart from Shinra and Iris, but that always struck me as a part of her design that was supposed to appeal to a part of the audience with particular tastes, rather than be a strength of her character. Now Iris, as I'm sure there's no reason to remind you, was just made a bystander in her own story. Hibana was the only character that Iris had any real depth of relationship with, and now that the confrontation between the two has been sort of resolved, I guess, there isn't really much more for Iris to do for the rest of Season 1, and she didn't really do all that much to begin with. This story decision to give a female character a close interpersonal connection with a villain and then waste it by making Shinra fight that villain for them repeats itself with Tamaki. Now, Tamaki is something of an infamous character already because Fire Force gives her an in-universe curse that forces her spontaneously into sexual situations against her will. It's gross and uncomfortable, and I don't think there's a single use of it in the show that I thought was clever or funny. In her arc, Tamaki is manipulated by a guy she has a crush on in order to help him with a project that, unbeknownst to her, is incredibly evil in nature. Obviously, as soon as she realises what's going on, Tamaki immediately turns on the guy and tries to stop him through force. However, despite her third-generation pyrokinetic powers, all pre-established laws of the universe, and basic logic, Tamaki doesn't even get to fight him. He immediately overpowers her and starts beating her senseless. This forces her to call for help, and who would show up to save the day other than Shinra, of course? Now too beat up to actually do any fighting, Tamaki has to just watch as Shinra fights the bad guy for her. Whilst the fight is going on, however, the bad guy accidentally strips Tamaki half naked with a fire attack, just like Iris was. Woo. Super glad that these scenes were included in an incredibly tense fight against a child murderer. So the fight resolves with Tamaki having been able to do absolutely nothing to stop her criminal crush who she'd been unwittingly helping, instead relying almost entirely on her male colleagues to do the work for her. Not to worry though, Tamaki doesn't need closure for this scenario. She doesn't express any guilt, or shame, or remorse, or any other emotion about the whole event. It doesn't inform her character at all going forward. In fact, the only consequence of her unintentional infanticide seems to be that it gets her away from the first for a short time and hanging out with the eighth more often. And I can't imagine why the writer of Fire Force wanted Tamaki to be hanging out with the eighth and therefore on screen more often. Fire Force is a story that seems to understand the importance of compelling backstory and high-stakes drama to keep its audience's attention. However, when it comes to the female characters, it seems completely unable to follow through on these aspects. Iris and Hibana might be the only survivors of a high-casualty accident, and Tamaki might be the accidental accomplice of a horrifying crime connected to the ongoing project of a religious terrorist organisation, but none of that stuff sticks. Instead, the author seems more focused on rushing through these girls' stories so he can get to his desired end for them, which appears to be whatever he thinks is cute or sexy for them to do, or have done to them. For more evidence of this, look no further than the Nether arc at the end of the show, in which the 8th Division is divided into pairs in a series of underground tunnels. Each of the male members of the 8th are split into pairs together, whilst Tamaki and Iris are a pair, and Maki is left on her own. Each of the stories revolving around the male pairs focus on their competence as combatants. Captain Obi and Vulcan prove that their physical training and inventions are more than a match for any third-generation pyromancy, despite having pyrokinetic powers of their own. Lieutenant Hanawa literally breaks out the big guns, and Arthur saves him by showing off the fruits of his latest training. Shinra also gets to mess around with his new technique before heading into the ultimate climax of the season, whilst Victor seems to be there to use his intellect in order to explain the mechanics of how Shinra and Sho are slowly breaking the rules of the universe. Maki does get to let loose as well, with some impressive fight scenes, but these scenes are bookended with segments of comedy derived from her pre-established notions of her femininity. Tamaki and Iris' storyline seems to be the author's attempt to inject moments of humour into a fairly serious chain of events, which I wouldn't be so opposed to if it weren't for the fact that the jokes are usually at the characters' expense, and that they are the majority of the female cast. Once again, the author takes the opportunity to build up a scenario which seems like the perfect opportunity for a solid fight scene and strong character development. Tamaki's opponent is hyped up by having other villains discuss how likely it is that he'll be able to kill all of the other members of the 8th by himself. It's a fairly clunky and inefficient way of establishing a threat, but it gets the job done. Meanwhile, Tamaki is having a flashback to a scene we haven't seen before. She's having a conversation with Shinra in which he's acting uncharacteristically dickish towards her. This seems to be so that the audience understands that Tamaki has something to prove. It's a fairly artificial injection into the story, however, and funnily enough wouldn't have been necessary if the author had just taken the time to develop Tamaki beyond the end of her last arc. As I said before, Tamaki should probably be expressing feelings of guilt and disappointment after being unable to defend either herself or the kids, but she should also have learned her lesson from that experience and taken the opportunity to develop herself as both a person and a fighter. This new opponent would then have provided Tamaki with the perfect opportunity not only to prove that she's capable of defending others, this time Iris and the rest of the 8th Division, but also to help redeem some of the guilt she's feeling over helping and being unable to stop a kid killer. Anyway, where was I? Oh yeah, hype villain, something to prove. Pyromantic powers in abundance, stuff flying everywhere, both sides getting the upper hand over one another only to lose it the next second, tension rapidly rising, and then it all ends after another one of those stupid fan service gags. Yeah, disappointing. Once again, the author decides to just discard something that might actually be worthwhile and interesting in favour of something kind of cheap and lazy. It's not just Tamaki that gets undermined by this writing, although losing her sexual autonomy for the upteenth time does certainly do an awful lot of damage. Every villain in this organisation that said that the guy who just lost to Tamaki's chest could have killed the entirety of the 8th kinda looks a bit like an idiot now, and that does an awful lot to lower the tension of the story overall. But hey, at least Iris gets stuck in for once. It seems weird to me that the person who comes closest to what I would consider to be respectful treatment of a female character in this show is Arrow. Whilst Arrow is no more or less powerful than any of the other members of the show's cast per se, she does manage to avoid having to perform the same quote-unquote desirable traits as the other women in Fire Force. Simply looking at how the women in this show are visually presented will go some way to explaining the difference. Arrow's design is conservative and practical, well-fitting without being skin-tight. There is as little exposed skin as necessary, so little in fact that even Arrow's face is covered most of the time. The most the show does to feminise her is in fact to show her face, seemingly just to confirm that, yes, is Grill, and there seems to be a practical purpose in doing so as it helps differentiate her design from Mirage's. Compare this to the other women's designs in Fire Force. Initially, Fire Force might seem to favour practicality over fan service in its uniform designs, what with the bulky overcoats worn in combat and the loose jumpsuits worn at base. But don't let these fool you. This show never turns down an opportunity to sexualise its female cast. When considering practicality, keep in mind that these are the primary combat designs for some of the female characters. Similarly, Iris is often drawn wearing a nun's habit that is both way tighter and way more revealing than what you would expect from a respectable member of the church, when she's allowed to wear clothes at all. Maki's tank top and baggy trousers seem like the least fetishized design of the main cast. But then again, this shot exists, so don't go thinking that the show leaves her alone either. So why does Arrow manage to avoid receiving the same treatment? Well, first and foremost, she's a villain. She kills people. I'm going to assume that the author believed that people wouldn't take her seriously as a threat if she was also treated as an object for the audience's desires. Which makes sense because I don't take any of the main female cast seriously anymore. This isn't to say that you can't have a female character who is both desirable and dangerous. The femme fatale trope is pretty well known and not unpopular. I do imagine that taking this route with Arrow would have made her overlap too much with either Hibana or Lisa's characters though, so that's another reason I'm glad that they didn't do that with her. Hooray for diverse female character writing! That being said, there is something strange about Arrow. I mean, other than the fact that she kills people, and that the author suddenly ran out of horniness when writing her. As a character, Arrow is incredibly bland. She never conveys any real emotion, nor does she communicate any greater depth to herself beyond, is one of the bad guys. She's more Terminator than terrorist, as close to a blank slate as you can get away with in a story. There's nothing in her facial expressions, her body language, her interactions with her allies, nothing to suggest an actual human being lives underneath her stony face. And that isn't in itself irredeemable. This show has a sizable cast to juggle, so lack of development on some characters is forgivable. And it's not unbelievable that a real human being would be this serious and reserved. However, as the one female character I could single out as non-sexualized, I was hoping for a little more from Arrow. It seems a little weird that the depth of the female characters in Fire Force is strongly correlated with their sex appeal. It helps present the interpretation that if a female character is to be prominent in the show's story, they have to be regularly sexualized, and that if they are a character that remains in control of their sexual autonomy, you know, like real women do, they'll be pushed into the background. The alternative, as also seen in Fire Force, is that when a female character favours power over pandering, they'll be framed as monsters for doing so. And in stories, monsters always have to be defeated by knights. I wanted to like Fire Force. I still kind of do, all things considered. But the contradiction between the female character's potential and their actual execution is just so jarring that it ended up being the main thing I remember about the show. Which is a real shame, because it's clearly an aesthetic choice that somehow seeped in and disrupted the narrative. But at the end of the day, if you're going to force feed me scenes of Tamaki being half naked for some stupid reason every episode, and if it's not her, some other member of the cast, then I can't get away from it. I'm not overanalyzing a pattern if I'm being bludgeoned over the head with it repeatedly. In the end, Fire Force's legacy for me isn't going to be a well-choreographed fight scene, some amazing animation, or even a charming character. It's going to be that it has forced me to reassess how female characters are written in other shonen action shows I like as well.